Hello, Bash.
How are you?
Good to see you.
Not because I suffer fast, not because I pray and fast. No be Ochonu, no be jazz. Akwachi, daily Osinachi, Namnukwa, Osinachi. One name, Osinachi, Akwachi, daily Osinachi, Mama, Osinachi.
Hello, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Hi, Wiba. Good to
Hi.
see everyone.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks.
you. Professor Chukwu, thank you. Good to see you.
Hi, everybody. Hello.
Hi, Bash. Thank you, guys. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it. Good to see everyone.
Prof, are you in Nashville?
No, I'm actually in Lagos.
Okay, I left last night. How long were you there?
Just for 2 days. I'll be here for 2 days.
Wow, you never called me.
I know. Are you around?
No, I left last
Not because I suffer fast, not because I pray and fast. No be Ochonu, no be jazz. Akwachi, daily Osinachi, Namnukwa, Osinachi. One name, Osinachi, Akwachi, daily Osinachi, Mama, Osinachi.
Hi, Oliver. Good to see you.
Hello.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah.
It's 10 o'clock, but well, 10:03. But we have about 8 participants. Maybe we wait for a few more minutes, especially since one of the panelists will not be attending. So we do have enough time. Maybe we start at 3:05. It's okay with everyone. Okay, I think it's time for us to start. I want to welcome everybody to this panel. My name is Gloria Chukwu. I'm Professor and Chair of Africana Studies at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Because one of the panelists will not be participating, we're going to extend the time from 8 minutes to 10 minutes if you have to use such amount of time. And we still have enough time for the author to respond. And after that, we would open the floor for audience questions and of course, discussion. So without much ado, we are going to follow the way your names appeared in the program. So we're going to start with Webua. If you can introduce yourself briefly before sharing your review of Moses' book.
All right, thank you very much, Prof. It's an honor to be part of this. Just by quick introduction, my name is Dr. Wiba Boer. I may not look Nigerian, but I was born and raised in Nigeria, and until yesterday was actually living in Lagos. Moses and I were actually did our PhDs in African history at the same time. He was at Michigan and I was at Yale. And then once we graduated, our paths kind of went in different directions. I left academia and Moses stayed on. And I'm so proud to see how he's become such a preeminent Nigerianist and Africanist. And reading this book was just, anyway, I was just in awe. So congrats, my brother, on this amazing achievement. But interestingly enough, since this panel was set up, and now I'm now moving back to academia, and as of Monday, I'll be the president of Calvin University. So now I'm back to academia, and I might have to start writing again. So just let me start by saying, it's just an absolutely wonderful and excellent book. Since I've been out of academia for a while, I have to say that the introduction, the Dogon Torenchi, was plenty. And for those of us commoners, it took me a little while to get used to it. But then once I got through that, it was just an absolutely smooth read, and just like it's so many stories in there that there's so much to unpack. But one of the things I really liked was how it humanizes some of our heroes past in a rarely done way. I mean, most of the times these sorts of the Emirs and all of that, they're sort of told in a very distant way that you don't connect with them. They almost don't seem like humans. And it especially in this time of increasing division between the north and the south of Nigeria, where there's sort of suspicion about, okay, the northern elite and what their objectives are and all that, you read this and you see how their forefathers were actually pretty much just like the rest of us, and they wanted to go to Europe to go on shopping trips and all of this kind of thing. And I just think that's actually a very important element of this for the day and time that we're in now. And so I hope that this book will become readily available in Nigeria. What often happens is when it's published by a non-Nigerian publisher, then it ends up being very expensive and very difficult to access locally. So I hope that will be made possible. And also maybe Moses is in Nigeria now to do this, but you should definitely do some kind of a book tour, because this book really needs to be read and needs to be understood in Nigeria. So let me just unpack a few things some of my impressions of the book. What I liked the most was about how, and this is a term I kind of made up, the otherer, and that's the colonialists who tried to make Africans the other, how the otherer is now being othered in this book, and how these, the subalterns, as Moses called them, when they went to England, when they went on these tours, even though they were carefully scripted and carefully structured to give them a certain impression, they also did basically their own ethnography while they were there and got a different view of this all-powerful colonialists in their own home. And while obviously they saw sort of the might of the empire and all that, they also saw how these people were in their own setting, and how many of them, while on the field in Nigeria or whatever, would be all powerful. Back home in England, they were just commoners. I mean, it's the same thing that happens today. You'll have someone who'd be like an American ambassador to Nigeria, and in Nigeria, they're just untouchable and out there. They come back to Washington, DC, and they stay in some small apartment and they're completely anonymous. So it's the same sort of thing. And I think what's great to see is that in the end, the colonial officials who are mentioned in the book, this may be the only place that those colonial colonial officers are ever mentioned in a historical work of historical in a work of in a book like this, and they're largely just footnotes of history, really lost to time. Their descendants are unknown. We don't know where they are. We don't know what they're doing. At the same time, the emirs who made these trips, who were the subordinates, are the ones who, through various means have actually survived. Their families are still in charge. They're still ruling, and they're still important people in society. So I think that's also an important element here. I particularly like the visits to Lugard, that all of these leaders felt like they needed to visit Lugard himself. And although it's not described, I cannot help but imagine that when they would visit him, I don't know where Lugard lived in England, but I'm sure it wasn't anything like the kind of, palaces sort of that he had lived in while ruling Nigeria. And in England, he was just a common person. He wasn't, all powerful and so on. So it probably was at the same time that they were respecting him for his role in the past, they probably also wondered about, okay, see how this man is where he is now. And Lugard's family is nowhere. I don't even know if he had children or whatever, but these others are now, like I said earlier, are now still ruling. Their children are still ruling. They're still significant. And Lugard, again, is just someone in the past. So a couple of other insights. You talked, there's a mention about so much of the sources of this come from a pretty rich Hausa literary tradition of the time. But it's interesting because now you don't see this. You don't see much of that around anymore. And so you just wonder, where are these travelogues? If they've been translated, are they accessible? And if not, I mean, we, again, similar to your own book, we need to find a way to pull them out and get them back on the shelves and get Nigerians reading them again, because these are such, again, important glimpses into the lives of these men from our past, and who had such a big role in the building of this nation. And the fact that those books that they read in the publications are relatively obscure now is obviously something we need to fix. I love the mentions of the Katsina family, the Katsina royal family in Polo. There's actually a huge chunk of that actually in my dissertation and in a book I'm releasing soon. But it also reminded me that there were, similar to the tours that are mentioned here, there were actually other tours specifically around sports. In 1948, there was a tour of Nigerian track and field athletes who went to the UK, and in 1949, there's the much more well-known one of the football team that went there. And again, it was a similar thing, they played their games or whatever, but then on the side, it was, they visited factories, they visited gardens, they visited zoos. And again, the same sort of attempt to give them this sense of the greatness of the empire while they were there, so that when they went back, in this case, instead of them being traditional rulers, they were still, famous and had followers and were able to kind of influence the way people looked at England. The visit of the Ata Vabira Ata Ibrahim from Okene, I think was particularly interesting, although I do contest Professor Ochonu's argument that the most significant or influential central Nigerian ruler is the Ata of Igala. I would argue, as someone who has roots in Wukari, I have to say it must be the Akuka, but we can argue about that later. But what's interesting is anyone who has been to the palace today in Okene, and I think the current ruler must be the grandson or great-grandson of Ata Ibrahim. It's interesting how you actually still see some of the relics from this trip, but then even further, the palace itself almost looks like something now from Alice in Wonderland. So it almost seems as if he, starting 2-3 generations ago, started taking some of these symbols from England and other places he visited and then brought them back to this palace and planted them there in a way that now almost looks comical. And so again, it's something that it would be interesting to juxtapose that trip and what came out of it with what is actually present there now. And then finally, just on these points, I like the way you ended with Tafawa Balewa to show that there's a continuity in post-colonialism, and that even after, there's no longer rule by the British, there is still this tradition of Nigerian leaders going to see leaders around the world. Then it was Tafawa Balewa going to see Kennedy. Obviously, over time, it was to visit, leaders in China, wherever, Soviet Union, wherever the kind of the power was at the time. And of course, more recently, we still see our leaders doing this and going on all sorts of study tours and the same sort of thing. But now it does seem like it's more just I don't even know what to call it. They don't seem to have any real significance, and it's more just they're using public money for their own personal shopping and so on. And there's really no learning happening anymore. So even while there's some sort of connection to that tradition, you just don't see the sort of the gravity of what the purpose of these trips are. So sort of on that also, I don't know if anyone saw this also, but a few months ago, or maybe even last month, the Olu of Wari made a state visit to Canada, and actually, kind of had all of the symbols of his rule, including a throne and everything. And he visited a number of native Canadian reservations, and sort of argued that this was, securing foreign investment, but also connecting with these, kingdoms in North America. It was all very, carefully scripted and everything. And those of us who know, I mean, Canadian traditional rulers or whatever don't actually have that much authority and power or anything like that. So it was sort of like a lot of symbolism that actually didn't have much result. But you can still see that he's still trying to kind of do the same thing that these folks were doing, these forefathers were doing some generations ago. So those are the insights. And then finally, I just wanted to say, I think two things that are missing. One is the kind of other side of this, where the British royalty visiting Nigeria, and what kind of pomp and circumstance was around that. For example, Queen Elizabeth having a durbar put on for her in Kano, as something that was traditionally Nigerian, even though durbars come from India. So that's one of the, I think that could have been a kind of an interesting little snippet to see how that compared to the visits the other way. But then also comparisons with Southern traditional rulers when they visited England, and whether, because of the, in this case, many of them were either Christian or not non-religious. Not non-religious, but neither Christian nor Muslim, but had obviously a kind of a different way of engaging with the colonial state, and just to see how those visits were similar or different. I think just something brief on that would have also been very interesting. So anyway, a fantastic book, lots of learnings. Everybody needs to read this book. Don't get stuck on the introduction. After the introduction, the Dogon Torenchi is diminished, and then the commoners can understand. So thank you, Prof. I'm incredibly impressed with this, and thanks for letting me be part of this.
Thank you. Just in time. The next speaker is Oliver Coates. Please, once I raise my hand, know that you have 1 minute to conclude.
Okay, thank you very much. So yeah, I'm Oliver Coates. I'm based in England at Cambridge University, and I should say I'm not a Hausa specialist by any means. So I'm going to trespass here into subject matter that is outside of my area of expertise. But that said, I made this book. I think it's a very important book in several ways. It's a book that I really hope it will be widely read by historians of Britain in the time that it's talking about, as well as by Africanists, because it's exactly the kind of work which I think is a corrective to a lot of narratives that still shape the way in which the colonial history in Britain is still written about, in terms of showing a kind of reverse ethnographic gaze on the part of these aristocratic travellers. But from my point of view, I think what interests me most here is the way in which this book shows a kind of African language, literature, and sources in a quite a different light to a way in which they might often be conveyed, which is it kind of brings them out into a kind of global dialogue almost. So it shows African language sources commenting on and analysing the world outside of Africa, in this case of Britain. And I think that this kind of uses a kind of Hausa sources in a distinctive and new way in this light. So it kind of situates Hausa language travel writing in a kind of wider kind of library of colonial travel writing that includes in Nigeria kind of Yoruba travel writing of the 20s and 30s by writers like I.B. Thomas, and perhaps also even other forms of mobility literature that are not defined by travel, like war memoirs by Isaac Fadayobo about Burma, or Bakary Diallo's book Force Bonte about fighting fighting on the Western Front in the First World War. So they're possibly kind of quite wide, generic parallels with other forms of colonial travel or mobility related writing. So Ochono's central contention in the book is that there's a vernacularized colonial modernity evinced by aristocratic writings and their dissemination in the Romanized Hausa press of the interwar period. And I think this is particularly important for two reasons. Firstly, it illustrates the degree to which African elites were engaged in a textual practice of interpretation and translation that enabled them to leverage and refine their own personal power and their own relationship with the colonizers. And secondly, it kind of shows the degree to which colonial publications like the Gasco Corporation publications became a forum for a kind of Hausa elite commentary on that outside world, and one wonders from that whether there's a parallel literature of Hausa language commentary and analysis about the United States, for example, as well as about Great Britain. Within the book, there are several kind of moments of analysis of these narratives, which reveal different textual devices, like one of which perhaps kind of ironically is the idea of boredom. So Ochonu talks about how different different newspaper articles in Gaskia convey a sense of sort of tedium or boredom by like amassing detail, and even there's like an arms race to get more and more detail in successive articles. So there's like an article about the training of, I think, the merchant marine or something, which goes into like loads and loads of detail. And this kind of, I wonder kind of what beyond kind of bombarding the reader with detail, what the writers are doing here, and whether there's slightly more to be drawn out of the self-fashioning of the writer through this kind of mobilization of boredom almost. Like, are they really showing expertise or data transfer or knowledge through accumulating this kind of this phenomenon of boredom? So whether it could be kind of culturally located. And then a kind of another area of kind of textual analysis, I think, within the book is in terms of the structuring of newspaper articles. So this structure of speech-like phrases that conclude articles. Sort of in the next edition of Gaskia, we're going to carry on talking about the subject, is one thing. And another one is this kind of dialogic form where successive questions elicit more and more information, and that's something as well that can be seen in like southern Nigerian journalism of the same period. So and both of these might be also related to quality of producing, like facticity, as Moses describes it, or kind of felicity to facts. So they're like active textual features. I have a kind of two kind of questions really from that, which are outside strictly of the scope of the book, but I think which are kind of interestingly related to the book, or at least to my mind, are one of which is whether to what extent the development of Romanized Hausa literature is actually a break within Hausa literature in such a radical way. So, for example, if we think of this literature of mobility rather than strictly travel, so not necessarily getting on a boat or a plane chartered by the colonial government and traveling to England, but rather the experience of having traveled, having gone somewhere, and the status that gives one, then there seem to be other examples in literature about kind of the kind of 19th century Hausa land, for example, which show mobility being associated with literary status. So like Lost, for example, in his contribution to the volume on trans-Saharan book trade, talks about how Arabic-speaking bookmen in 19th century northern Nigeria were kind of international in character, or like evinced a kind of cosmopolitanism within an Arabophone trans-Saharan literary field. And similarly, Reichmuth, in his analysis of Illyrian book culture in the 19th century, describes it as strictly kind of cosmopolitan. Although these people are not necessarily like traveling themselves, there's a kind of aura of travel and aura of geographical kind of mobility that is associated with texts. I don't know about a Ajami kind of Hausa literature, whether there are examples from that as well, but it seems that these are possibly longer term cultural discourses within in the Hausa or within northern Nigerian literary culture at least. And secondly, rising from that, to what extent is this figure of the aristocratic traveller imparting information in the reader really specific to the colonial period necessarily, or is it that there are important dimensions in the colonial period, like the fact they're stewarded by the colonial government and things like this? But in fact, are there kind of parallels outside of the colonial period in terms of accruing status and accruing kind of authority through travel? And there are various genres, at least within like Arabic literature, like tarjuma or like biography or like kind of spiritual this kind of autobiography, that where travel, in that it often, the Hajj is associated with kind of spiritual fluency or spiritual proficiency. And so whether whether these textual characteristics in some ways, like the kind of dialogues particularly, seem to potentially have parallels in kind of certain aspects of text in the core Islamic curriculum, like theological texts, for example, where there's a dialogue between a teacher and a student. And so whether there are parallels culturally with that, I think is a kind of interesting point. And more generally then, finally, the way in which travel writing, which seems to be a new genre to this period, and certainly the publishing landscape is specific to the period with newspapers and corporations, how far that is comparable to earlier international genres within the Sahel, like Qasida poetry, for example, which traveled from Middle Eastern writing and Middle Eastern book markets to the Sahel, or kind of or phenomena like palindromes, which are kind of elaborated by different writers across the Sahel and kind of shared. So how far, okay, travel writing is specific to this period, but are there kind of meaningful parallels with other traveling genres that are specific to northern Nigeria and the Sahel, but that predate colonialism? If I have like any more time at the end of that, I had kind of one final kind of question, which I suppose regards the quality of subalternity within the book, which is that how far what is the nature of this aristocratic kind of subaltern positionality? So on the one hand, these are subaltern subjects insofar as the structural power relations of colonialism and the discursive and ideological effects of colonial racism, for example, position them in a subordinate relationship to colonial power. But in another sense, these are, even at the time, perceived in certain quarters, like in the 1943 tour of London by Azikiwe and Southern journalists, as being aristocratic kind of compradors of colonial powers, not only like later by nationalist historians, but even at the time. So what is a kind of variegated or complexity to that label of kind of elite subalternity that is in the minds of other Nigerian observers at the time? And is that something that is challenged in northern reading public as well, or is that more accepted within the kind of house of readership than it is in the South at that time? Thank you.
Thank you. Jafar?
Okay. Thank you for having me on this session. My name is Jafar. I'm the editor-in-chief of Daily Nigerian, an online newspaper in Abuja, but I'm currently in London on that side. Yeah, this book is a very richly written book that contains a lot of histories, a lot of interviews, researches, and so many things. The book has dug deeper to unearth a lot of colonial letters, correspondences about Nigerian past, especially regarding the travels. What we normally had in the past was just hearsays about how the travels were conducted or how the itineraries were. But with this book, it gives us an insight with credible references to colonial records showing how everything were done, how the travels, what happened during the travels, what happened after the travels, about the travelogues, and so many things the book covers a lot of things, a lot of issues. It is almost reading so many books in just one book. If you don't have something, if you don't read Tapia Mawudin Ilimi, you've got copious references about the book that you understand the theme of the book. If you don't read about Dada Sare's encounter with Rupert East, the book also covers everything about that, which once you read this book, you get to know how Dada Sare's book also, what's actually the theme of Dada Sare's book, and so many other books that were referenced in the in this particular book. And then there are so many way Ochonu captures the translation. Even native speakers, Hausa native speakers will be really envious, because I see the accuracy and the way he gets the correct translations of some of the Hausa. And as part of his researches, I think he conducted interviews in Hausa, which he translated in English. And then there are a lot of documents that he sourced, which are originally in Hausa. And I think others might even be in Ajami Arabic. But the way he translated everything to fit rightly into the context is really amazing, really. Even as a native speaker, I can say that I can't do any better. I must commend the author for this feat. And then I have noticed that the book, as I think we've also made a similar observation, the Southern Nigerian aristocrats, at least the book should have at least maybe in a passing mention, maybe talk about some of the travels of the Obas, Obis. And I think Alaki of Abeokuta has visited London, I think in 1904, even long before, 3 years earlier, before even Diko was taban as emir or was appointed as emir by Lugard. So it's something at least that was a little mentioning, since we are all, it's still about Nigeria. So at least maybe in revised edition, maybe some of this would be captured. And then I also, the author also did not mention Diko's smoking habit. I know he's very, he was a chain smoker, and then he bought cigarette lighters while in London. He's very fond of, I think there are some press clips that I saw which talk about his smoking habits. I think in British Newspaper Archive, I saw something like that. And then I made some observations about, there is on page 90, the author talk about a colonial officer called Karengia, who was nicknamed Karengia. On page 90, the author wrongly made it 2 words. Say Karengia, Kare meaning dog. So it should be Karengia. You understand? So Karengia is a grass. It's a tropical grass that is very prickly in nature, and that is very stubborn. Once it clings on your fabric or on any dress, it will stubbornly cling to that. It is very hard to remove on cloth. So Karengia, everybody that is familiar with, sorry, I hope I lost the, hello?
We do hear you.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
So
Okay.
say,
Yeah, I mistakenly reduced the window, shut the window. So yeah. So Karengia is a grass. The author should take note of this. It's a tropical common name. It's Indian sandbar. I think the botanical name is Cencros biflorus is the botanical name. And then the common name is Indian sandbar. If you check Bajiri's Hausa dictionary, you will see the exact meaning of Karangia. You will see that it is noted. Even on Wikipedia, it is also explained. And then on page 152, the author wrongly said that Ado Bayero ran from 1956 to 2014. It is 1963 to 2014. On page 208, the author correctly wrote the Karangia, how it should be written without making it a two-word. So you can see how he tries to get it right there. So on page, I think it is on page 255, as they were sitting. Is it sitting? I think there is a little, have you noticed that page 255? It should be sitting, not seating. As they were sitting, okay, noted that.
Yeah, I've noted it. Thank you.
Okay, then on page 283 is, I think it should be number. It should be, yes, number plates, not plate number. I think. Yeah, then on page 300, there is also issues with dates. You can see page 300, sorry, on page 300. It started with saying in 1961 on the initiative of the Prime Minister's Office, a Northern Nigerian 18-5 team composed mostly of Northern bureaucrats, including at least one official who was taking a 6-month course to Britain toward the cities of Oxford, Cambridge, and Birmingham. So
page three, exact. Can you tell me the page again?
Page 300.
Oh, 300. Okay, I got it.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, and it started with in 1961.
Yes, I see it. Yeah.
Yes, I think it should be in 1960.
Okay.
Because you can see down in the second paragraph, it's following this outreach by Bello and his entourage, Atom Pipe's team visited Northern Nigeria in 1961.
Okay.
So definitely it must be, since you're talking about January. Yeah, so I think it is, I noticed this. Then also page 316, there is mix up on, I think you wanted to write King George V, you wrote King Edward V.
Yes.
Page 316. And then I have, even before this session, I've drawn the author's attention to the, should I say, unsuitability of the cover picture. I've noted that because I'm not so much, I do not agree with him that it is the best picture, because there are so many pictures of the Emirs in London, and the cover page only shows one out of the many Emirs that visited London. And there are many pictures of the Emirs that can be enhanced if it is about resolution. And there are even some good ones. And if it is about color, it can be colored. So even if that is not necessary, it can be sketched, like the visit of Emir of Diko to King George. So at least that visit, I don't know why I have never seen the picture of that visit. It is still like a miracle. I've written accounts of the visit, but I have never seen the picture. So at least maybe I don't know why I was expecting really to see that picture in this book, going by the efforts the author did to get so many facts typed down. So I thought that picture would be in the book. And then also the women who also visited London. I think there was a contingent of women who visited, I think it was is it close to independence or shortly after independence. So at least the name of I've been thinking that I could get the names of some of the women. I think none was mentioned, I think, in the book. And then I think, and then this Jaka, there is this description of Jaka on page 77. On page 77. Yeah, so Jaka, I think it may be maybe a post-colonial name, but we grew up to know that Jaka means 200 naira. Yes, that is how maybe going to Hajj in those days, Jaka Goma, that is like 2,000 naira. So it was counted in Jaka. It may not be maybe due to the size of the money, but I would agree with you that Imam was trying to be hyperbolic or trying to see way of describing, because we don't have those numbers in Hausa, to describe the volume of the money that was used to build London Bridge. So I think saying Jaka Ashirin was not trying with 200. You understand, with 20 Jaka Ashirin is just small change. Yeah. So I think London Bridge was built with over £1 million at that time. So £1 million Jaka will be more than 1 million Jaka if it is actually that. There is some issues there I noticed with that. It may be, he may be right really that he was trying to say that maybe, I don't know whether it is bag or Jaka was said in the book, so that I will know whether he means bag or just little Jaka for clinging on shoulders. And then this Langalanga also, this onomatopic name for a very tall and slight built person. We describe Langalanga as machete. Yes, but in Hausaland, it is not the case really. It is like a band. There is a metal band that is used to tie a bell of roofing sheet. Very flexible band, metal band. So that is what we call Langalanga. I've asked a number of people who are even older than me to see what actually Langalanga is. Everybody told me it was that. So it's any tall, lanky person is called Langalanga, is an onomatopic topic name for Langalanga. It may be probably the colonial officer might have worked at a town called Langalanga. There is a town, I think, in Benue axis area where famous train accident occurred in early 70s. The town is called Langalanga. It may be probably the colonial officer worked there. Probably that is why he earned the moniker of Langalanga, but probably it may be due to his slightly built stature. That is why he's called Langalanga. It may be one of the two, but certainly not machete. Yes, I think these are my observations, but the book truly, what Swiba said, apologies to Wiba that forget the Dogon Turanchi in the preface, in the introduction, but really, I really enjoyed the book and I would recommend it any day, anytime. Thank you so much for hosting me on this session.
Thank you. Thank you. Mohammed Salah, you have the floor.
Thank you. I'm Mohammed Salam, Professor of African History at the University of Mississippi. I thank the conference organizers for including me in this panel, which is meant to celebrate Moses and his recent accomplishment. I'm glad to participate in this panel for several reasons, including because Moses and I draw on tribal writing in our research on Northern Nigeria, because to a certain degree, we ask similar questions. Historically, some of the ethnic groups that call present-day Northern Nigeria home have been known to be more adventurous than most ethnic groups in West Africa. Given that the Hausa and other ethnic groups that call present-day Northern Nigeria home have a long history of travel from their homeland to different parts of the world, it is not surprising that they develop travel writing within different geographical zones and historical contexts. Emirs in London draws partly on some of the travel writing developed within the colonial period of Northern Nigerian history. In addition, it draws on several other sources, including colonial records and European newspapers accounts. The focus of the book is the travels of Northern Nigerian aristocrats to the United Kingdom from the 1920s to 1960s. In focusing on this issue, Emirs in London deepens our understanding of the agency, views, and experiences of people of African descent in the Atlantic world, and contributes in many ways to the existing literature on British imperialism on Africa. Moreover, in focusing on this issue, it also adds to the literature on Islam, on politics, as well as to the literature on Northern Nigeria. There are several works on Africans who live permanently or quasi-permanently in Imperial Britain and elsewhere in the Atlantic world. Yet the story of Africans who undertook brief visits to Britain and other societies outside of their homelands have largely been left out of the history books. Emirs in London contributes to addressing this gap, partly by examining the origins and evolution of the travel of Northern Nigerian emirs, chiefs and aristocrats to Britain during the colonial period. It traces the origin of aristocratic travel back to 1921, when Emir Mohammed Diko of Katsina Emir made a trip to London with the main purpose of sightseeing. Diko was recruited as an ally by the colonialists through a long, elaborate process, and his reputation as a reliable colonial partner made it possible for the British colonizers to select him as the first Northern Nigerian emir to visit Britain. After Diko's first trip to London, the culture of traveling to London for health reasons, business, vacations, and leisure became widespread among aristocrats and Western educated elites by 1960. Moses ties the increasing metropolitan travels and the growing transatlantic interaction and mutual patronage between the new political elites of Northern Nigeria and the new imperial government of the United Kingdom after this day to the post-colonial challenges of nation building and the imperative of catching up with a much more socio-economic developed Southern Nigeria. He also argues that although the culture of metropolitan travel was mainly crucial to the self-making and modernist claim of the Northern Nigerian aristocracy, it became redefined as a diplomatic undertaking designed to attract British technological and technocratic assistance to the government of Northern Nigeria in the late 1950s and the 1960s. Emirs in London is interesting because it's unlike previous works on Africans in Britain, analyzing the fast evolving imperial networks, discourses, and logistical infrastructure that facilitated and shaped the trips of the Northern Nigerian aristocrats. As Moses concludes, the imperial network, discourses, and logistical infrastructure that developed, that shaped the trips of Northern Nigerian aristocrats made it logical to take travel, not as an event, but as an entire universe of bureaucratic and political practices, linking vast temporal and spatial formations. Emirs in London's focus on such themes as travel, logistics, colonial mobility, and so on, allows it to undermine the notion that Africans were passive actors. The notion that Africans were passive actors exists partly within works on imperial spectacle and royal tours in Africa, and within the emerging work on imperial loyalism, as well as in the works that analyze traditions. Accordingly, in undermining the notion that Africans were passive actors, Emirs in London contributes to works that deal with these issues. In addition to undermining the notion that Africans were passive actors, the book stresses the performative character of the colonial interactive space and offers original insight into the nature of colonial hierarchy, demonstrating that colonial hierarchy could be reversed. Emirs in London contributes to the literature that centers the voices and perspectives of Africans in the study of the British Empire. Of the few studies of African aristocratic travel in the British Empire, none has offered a Muslim perspective, and none has demonstrated how African aristocratic travelers demarcated metropolitan culture from an Islamic culture. Emirs in London fills this gap by stressing the voices and perspective of Northern Nigerian Muslim rulers. In stressing the voices and perspectives of these Muslim rulers, the book sheds light on the idioms, hyperboles, similitude, and other literary devices employed by the aristocrats in their travel narration. Moreover, in stressing this same issue, it also adds to the literature of non-Western travelers' representation of the West. In this regard, it demonstrates that unlike European representations of Africa, Northern Nigeria aristocratic representations of the West sought to bridge a cultural gap between the metropole and the periphery, even though they emphasize the differences between the Muslim Hausa and British cultural practices. It also demonstrates that Northern Nigeria aristocrats use their representation of the West, their travel narration, and the institution of travel to enrich their migratory repertoires. In contrast to scholars who conceive colonialism as a consistently adversarial struggle between the colonizers and the colonized, Emirs in London stresses the strategic, transactional, affective connections between the colonizers and the colonized. In stressing this theme, it argues that sometimes such situational relationship rested on the Africans' dexterity in taking strategic advantage of colonizers' self-appointed role as avuncular benefactors to Africans, and that at other times, Africans proactively cultivated European colonial interlocutors as allies in their quest to access privileges or enter exclusive networks. In addition, in stressing the same thing, it features the story of an African woman, Dada Sare, to not only illustrate that the connection between the colonizers and the colonized were often transactional and situational, but also to draw attention to gendered colonial violence. There exists a significant literature on religion and politics in Africa. Some of these literatures stress a global clash of culture in which Islam is pitted against the West. Other writers reject this clash of culture interpretation, partly by demonstrating how Muslims have absorbed a great deal from the West. Emirs in London enriches the latter interpretation by stressing that the Islamo-colonial modality in Nigeria, and I quote, was enabled and sustained by a culture of travel to Britain and the material and textual practice and processes that this type of travel spawned, end of quote. In the context of emphasizing this argument, the book contributes not only to our understanding of the ways in which the relationship between Northern Nigerian Muslim elites and Western modernity has evolved, but also to our understanding of how the culture of literacy developed in Northern Nigeria. Those are some of the key contributions of the work. Like other contributors have noted, there are some weaknesses. I didn't really spot a lot of those grammatic problems or Hausa terms that Jafar mentioned, but however, I agree with some of their observations. of it is that one of the components of the aristocrats' experience in London was their encountering many residents or visitors of African descent, some of whom were even their northern Nigerian subjects. While Emirs in London makes passing references to members of the entourage of the aristocrats, it does not focus enough on the interaction between the aristocrats and members of their entourage, as well as but to other Africans, and probably the Yoruba chiefs and others that they were making, right? Or as well as their interaction with even their wives, even when they were in London. I recognize that this may be due to the challenges posed by the records, but nevertheless, this is one observation. And we have to bear in mind that the 1940s, 1950, we are also Northern Nigerian educated, being educated in London. People like Ochonu, right? Tafawa Balewa were already in London by the late 1950s and so on. So probably there was interaction between these groups, and Diko and his son and other emirs were so much concerned about modernity. Modernity is a theme that runs through a lot in this particular world. And there are works on Islamic societies, one of them focusing on Northern Nigeria itself, which talks about colonial modernity. And the emirs will be shocked about the ideas of people like Ochonu, right? Who wanted totally the traditional institutions and structures to be abolished in some sense, right? So one of the problems in essence that I find is the lack of this focus on the meaning of the term modernism, the nature of modernity, and the engagement with some of this literature. I'm curious to know. I get a sense of it, but I'm curious to know, right, what this work in particular tells us about all of these issues. And then in addition to that, I think Oliver Coates talked about the travel writings, travel by Northern Nigeria and travel narratives are presented in the work as a recent phenomenon, right? And in reality, travel and travel narratives among the Hausa people have been a part of a long tradition, right? And so I'm curious to know why
And I think at this time I would just add few words before giving the author the opportunity to respond. I must commend Moses for this wonderful, brilliant piece of work, the methodology, multiple sources used, the coverage, including ethnic diversity. Not only if you hear the word Emir, you think it's focusing only on the Connaught, but of course, including Igala and Nupe and others, gives the work the complexity and the historical craft involved in putting together all the pieces. I really commend, and also adding gender, even though in the epilogue, in the discourse, is also commendable. I just have one or two questions. One is whether, pardon me if I didn't get that in the book, whether you incorporated the perspectives of Northern Muslim community. There was a literate community at the time in Britain about these various visits of the aristocrats. And secondly, you talked about in the introduction travels as political economy of African mobilities and emotional economy. And I'm wondering, where do all these travels you discussed, or the travelogues you discussed, fall into? I understand your explanation of political economy, but shouldn't emotional economy be part of the political economy too? And thirdly, whether you consider, I know the focus is on the metropole, but in terms of religious metropole, in reference to Mecca, we are aware that European colonizers sponsored Hajj of Muslim aristocrats for obvious reasons. And I'm wondering whether you explored some of the travelers that came out of such Hajj-sponsored travels to Mecca, and whether there are any generational differences you notice in the travels or travelogues of these aristocrats. What a wonderful book. Thank you. So you have the opportunity to respond, and after that, we hear what the people, the audience has to say about the work.
Well, wow, I'm overwhelmed and just completely blown away by the quality and of the engagement with the work. I truly, truly, from the bottom of my heart, thank everyone who has just engaged with this work in a remarkable and in a rewarding way. Thank you for this effort. I'm in your debt now, so feel free to ask me to repay this debt. I'm truly grateful. I'm going to respond to some of a few comments. Let me just go by the order in which they were made. Some of the questions. Yeah, I mean, I honestly was torn between when it comes to covering, you know, the visits of the royal family to northern Nigeria. The only reason I didn't go into that was because I thought it would distract from my main focus on the northern Nigerians' exploration of the other side. You know, I'm focusing on the exploration in the other direction. And I also thought that you know, there probably is enough work already dealing with the, you know, Durbar and visits of the royal family to northern Nigeria, but also to other parts of colonial British Africa, southern Africa. There's a small literature on that. So, and this other point came up in both Jafar's and Dr. Boa's engagements. The missing southern Nigerian component. I think the only southern Nigerian explorer of Britain or traveler that I mentioned is Ajala. And yes, I should have mentioned the Alake, especially the Alake. So that is definitely an omission. I think in my mind, when I was writing this book, I thought to myself, you know what? People already know about southern Nigeria. People expect southern Nigerian chiefs and kings to visit Britain. And they did. And from the 19th century, southern Nigerians were already in Britain, studying to become lawyers and doctors. So that would not be a big revelation. That would not surprise anyone. People already are familiar with that story. And I just thought, let me just focus. And I saw those pictures of the Alaki in his flowing gown. It's remarkable. He was even more flamboyant than the Northern Emirs. But I thought, that's a familiar story. And that's the only reason why I didn't go into that, actually. But in hindsight, at least I should have mentioned the Alaki's visit, since I think, in a way, he was a pioneer of this type of aristocratic exploration of Britain. And if I do a revised edition of the work, definitely I'll mention him. Oliver's engagement was quite, thank you, Oliver, for this deep theoretical and conceptual engagement. I appreciate and I take your point about the parallels, right, that you mentioned, and I'm going to look into them, especially in the Sahelian travel literature. I also take your point, and I'm grateful for your emphasis on this tradition being an older, even in Hausa land, even in the Hausa literary tradition being a much older one. And I agree with that, and I absolutely do. My only comment there would be that, I think in the introduction, and I think in chapter 1, I wanted to gesture in that direction, and maybe I could have done a better job of highlighting it. And I wanted to gesture in the direction of stating that, these travelogues were written to invoke an older folkloric tradition. Like, I think Jafar will be familiar with, there's a lot of Hausa literature on the theme of adventure, right? It's not just Ruwan Bagaja, it's so many, I can mention several, that deals with this theme of, it's an older tradition. So of adventure, of somebody traveling to a very far land and meeting strangers, sometimes getting lost, and people coming to his rescue, and then he emerges and he becomes this heroic traveler. So there's definitely that. Maybe I should have highlighted that, the continuity with that tradition more, but thanks for that comment. And I absolutely agree. It's not, and then the other point about the subalternity. You're absolutely right. What is funny is that I call them aristocratic subalterns. I mean, they were subalterns, right, in the colonial context. But if you had asked at that same time, if you had asked people like Saadu Zungur, right, Aminu Kanu, Moody Speaking, and other people on the Northern Nigerian left, I'm sure they would have, I don't know, maybe they would have objected to the term subaltern. They wouldn't have seen them exactly, because subaltern is traditionally a term that you would apply to, regular folks like you and I, right, under colonialism, not aristocrats with all these privileges who were essentially partners with the British, right, in indirect rule. And so it's not just Southern Nigerians who I think would have objected, would have had objection to that term. But I think even in the North, they existed. Even Gumi, even Sheikh Gumi, he had a critique of some of these emirs, some of these aristocratic travelers. For instance, he criticized, the ways in which they would go there and get awarded and get knighted by the king and get all these medals, right? Because some of these, medals were named after neo-Christian figures, and he had his own critiques based on a populist Islam, So I think the subaltern characterization, I think maybe deserves to be unpacked, but it's something that I take your point that definitely it's there were subalterns, no question about it, but I think we can call them subalterns. This is 2022, but at the time, even to some extent, I mean, I think that still exists. That dichotomy still exists. If you go to the northern Nigeria today, especially in the Emirates, there are people who still have resentment towards aristocracy, and who express this resentment, and who would maybe take issue with the fact that you are making these people out to be some type of marginalized, subordinate group. They will tell you, look, these people had never been poor. They had always had privileges, and so on and so forth. So thank you for that remark. Jafar, I cannot just thank you enough for that. You justified my, including you on this panel, because I cannot thank you enough for the meticulous reading that you gave the work, and for all the things that you caught that I missed. This has given me work to do, because I'm trying to do a Nigerian edition of the book. So definitely you've given me stuff to correct and to look to rework. And if there's a revised edition, obviously this would, but I cannot thank you enough for this very detailed, fine-grained, meticulous reading of the work. And I take all your points, absolutely. Let me see. So, and then Salau's questions. Thank you very much, my friend and colleague and brother, Bashir Salau. Thank you for those that powerful engagement. Those questions, I mean, the interactions between the emirs and members of the entourage and other Africans. The short answer to that question would be that, you know, we don't see that a lot in the sources. We don't see a lot of that. I think the sources mostly, even the travelogues, they somehow omit the interactions among themselves. We see snippets of it, which I covered in the book. They don't talk about, you know, in fact, the emirs wanted to shield their wives from the British press. You know, they were covered extensively. The British would, it was almost like paparazzi before paparazzi. They would follow them around, and it was quite embarrassing. On many occasions, they even had to abort. And this was something that was concerning to the emirs, you know, conservative Muslim aristocracy. They, you know, they are not in the habit of displaying their wives. So they didn't even want their wife to be covered. They didn't want anything to be said about their wives. And whenever they would be asked questions about their wives, they would shut it down. And the other part of it is that they were moved around in chauffeur-driven cars. So this was a quasi-diplomatic circuit that they moved in. And I think this shielded them from other Africans who were living in London at the time. There was even an incident, I think in 1924, when Dikko was visiting the Empire exhibition, where there was a protest going on against racism by Blacks in Britain at the time. And he was completely oblivious to this massive protest against racism because, you know, it was just a question of him getting out of the limousine, being driven to the next place to visit. He would get in and he would be hosted to dinner and tea. So these things were invisible to him. So these interactions, I think, were made almost impossible by these types of colonial protocols. The question of modernity, yes. And I think maybe I should have done a better job of delineating the kind of modernity that I was referring to. Obviously, there are different kinds of modernity. And people like Dikko and the Sultan and others who visited, and Etunupe and the rest of them, I think they had their own distinct idea of modernity. And that the way that they saw modernity, they didn't see modernity in this nuanced way that we see it now, which is it has Islamic roots. You have Islamic modernity, you have parallel modernity, you have Asian modernity, you have traditional modernity. You have all kinds of modernities now. But at the time, I think their view of modernity was quite narrow because they bought into the colonial project, civilizing project. And they thought, you know, modernity is associated with modern goods coming from Britain, modern colonial goods and practices, Western education, cars and schools and hospitals and so on and so forth. So that's the narrow way. I mean, I should have probably done a better job of really delineating that narrow conception of modernity in the way that the emirs saw them. All right, so I think Gloria's question, thank you, Professor Chukwu. I'm telling you, these questions are forcing me to rethink some of these issues. The perspectives of Northern Nigerian Muslim communities in Britain on the emirs. The only glimpse that I have of that is the later period in the 60s, when these visits became formalized as almost, because the Northern Nigerian government was semi-autonomous, I should say. And they had an ambassador. They didn't call him an ambassador. They call him a representative in Britain. So he would visit all of this. There were many Northern Nigerians schooling in Britain at the time because there was this policy of Northernization, because they wanted to train as many Northern personnel as possible to catch up with the South in preparation for independence. So he would visit them in their schools and he would interact with them extensively. The unfortunate thing is that I think in one of the chapters, there's only one chapter where the perspective of the students in Britain comes through. I think it's chapter 4, if I'm not mistaken. Two of them wrote to Gaskia about their experiences studying in Britain. But unfortunately, they don't talk too much about their interactions with the emirs, the visiting emirs, or the representative. On several occasions, the emirs would visit the sons, and they were mostly sons, not daughters. They were the sons of other emirs studying in Britain. they will send them to go give them money or gifts. So, oh, your father sends this, how are you doing? And they will go meet them in the hotel. So, I cover these types of interactions. But it was basically amongst the aristocracy. Oh, you are going to Britain. Oh, my son is in this and that. So make sure you see him. And then the son comes to the hotel and there's that interaction. Yes, travel is, I think you're right. Travel is both, you're absolutely right. I agree. I take your point. It's both an emotional phenomenon as well as a political, economic phenomenon. I didn't mean to, maybe it didn't come across clearly, but I didn't mean to create a dichotomy between the two. I think what the emirs were doing and the aristocrats were doing was both emotional, but also political, economic, in the sense that they were buying goods and consuming goods and transforming these goods and engaging with British materiality in a very political way, and they were using those things to enhance their power. So I don't think you can separate the two. Thank you very much for that insight. And finally, religious in the Hajj. That's a tough one. That's a tough question. Yes, they sponsored people on the Hajj, but unfortunately, the colonial records don't, the British representative in Mecca and in the Hejaz and in Saudi Arabia would always facilitate these visits by the emirs, especially those of them that combine the pilgrimage to Mecca with the visit to London, Dikko, Ibrahim, and several others. But unfortunately, I think what I see in the sources, and this is, I'm not 100% on this, but my suspicion is that the colonial record would cut off right around where the emirs arrive in the Holy Land to perform the Hajj. And then there will be nothing. My sense is that obviously the British representative in the Holy Land didn't follow them around, was not part of their itinerary. And so, but then in the travelogues, the travel of their description of their time in Mecca was also, from my observation, quite brief. They would just do the formulaic thing of describing who they saw. Or we met with the king and he hosted us. And due to the intervention of the British consul, we were able to visit this and everybody was nice, but it was very perfunctory. There was nothing, unfortunately, that's where the sources fall short. But yes, there was that as well. Thank you very much. I appreciate the comments from the bottom of my heart. Thank you. I'm not.
Chair, you're on mute.
How long have I been on mute? I'm so sorry. Okay, I was saying that I can't see any question in Q&A or in the chat. So the participants, this is your turn to ask your questions. I don't think I will see you if you raise your hand because I can't even see you. So if you have a question, you have to type it.
Hello.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Professor Chuka. Of course, an exciting and quite insightful presentations and responses to the book, and I appreciate that. Professor Salau, thank you for your, deep engagement with the text. But you said something that made me a little curious because I find it very difficult to believe that Ochonu in the book was able to unlike different scholars whose works focus majorly on the conflict between the colonizer and the colonized, Ochonu was able to establish, a transactional relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. Of course, there has persistently been interactions and transactions between the colonizer and the colonized. But what is the nature of the transaction that existed? Was it a transaction that was based on equity, justice, and fairness, based on equal shares, equal opportunities, and equal advantages, or one in which the colonizer always has an upper hand, always has an advantage over the colonized? I like the term used by Ochonu in that text, as observed by Oliver Coates, that what we saw in the text is Emir subaltern or privileged subaltern. That idea of, being a subaltern, does it negate the fact that the transaction between the colonizer and the colonized would always be dubious, unfair, one-sided, and giving power to one side of the transaction and less power, less advantages to the other side? Because I know that colonialism is always in the advantage of the colonizer, whose persistent intention is to exploit, steal, and destroy, even kill, as in the case of Tanzania and Kenya. That's my response to you, Professor Salah. And lastly, please, in 30 seconds, Professor Ochonu, thank you for your book. Of course, this book also leads us to your presentation yesterday when you were talking about the Journal of African History. One of the important remarks you made was that any paper to be published in the journal must focus on people who are based in Africa. And the question I typed in the chat, which I was unable to have a response to, was that what's your definition or your description of Africa? Does Africa focus majorly on people on the continent and less significantly on people outside of the continent, because the Emirs came from northern Nigeria and they were in London? What is it? Because I'm saying this not only because of you and not only because of your book. I'm in African literature. People often criticize writers whose works are set in Europe and America, saying that they are Eurocentric. What is the significance of Africa in Europe, in America? To what extent should we focus significantly on Africans that are outside of Africa? Your book engages that, from the perspective of the Emirs in London, but maybe you want to enlighten me more on the need for us to concentrate on the African diaspora, African travels, and things like that. Thank you.
I can speak to that. I think let me take a stab at, even though you directed it at Salah, then I'll come to your other question. I think the thing that I think colonialism affected, let me say, but colonialism was not monolithic. Colonialism affected different groups of Africans differently. Different groups of Africans, different genders of Africans, different ages of Africans, experienced colonialism differently. And so the idea that the aristocrats were able to, because of their privileged position, were able to get into all kinds of transactions that were self-interested and beneficial to themselves under colonialism should not come as a surprise, especially in the context of indirect rule, which was a partnership really that benefited both sides. There's no question that one side was predominant, the British side, everything that they did. Even the travels that I described, these travels were quite scripted to produce certain outcomes. However, I think we don't do justice to the Emirs and the aristocrats who undertook this travel. And I think it was Bashir Salah who said it actually, that and I don't know, Oliver Coates, and to some extent Weber as well, that these emirs had their own agenda. They had their own, they had their own purpose on going on these trips. And I show clearly in the book that when they would go to London, they would deviate from the official scripts. They would go on their own tangents. They would explore London in the way, and the UK in the way that they wanted, because they wanted to come back home with stories and with artifacts that would enhance their own position. And not only that, they wanted, if you look at my description of their mastery of colonial protocol, they knew what to say to the British interlocutors. They knew how to behave themselves in these outings. And the whole point was to keep this relationship and keep this beneficial relationship going. So I think that's the context in which one talks about transaction. It's not transaction in the sense of just relationship, horizontal relationship between equals. And then to your question, when we talk
Thank you. For addressing the question. The colonial officials, the British officials and so on, sometimes you should know that they are individuals with their own agendas and their own attachment, peculiar attachment to Africans and so on, right? So in essence, to extend what Moses is saying, we have to recognize their agency. And in that context, even though the relationship between the colonizers and the colonized is often exploitative, right? And power rests mainly on the parts of the colonizers. We have to have this nuanced understanding that agency can shape some of these, both on the side of the Europeans who are based in Africa and the African subjects.
I think we have two more minutes. I don't know if anybody has anything to add. Because I don't see any questions. Well, in absence of any other comments or questions, I want to thank the panelists and also Moses for giving us this wonderful book that, as many other panelists have said, I want to reiterate, should be made available in Nigeria so that Nigerians can have access to the book and read it, and also be motivated by the agency of these Africans, and also expand the study to other frontiers based on the questions raised. So I am grateful to be part of this important panel. And again, congratulations, Moses, and thank you again to the panelists for your interventions. And of course, to our panelists, the members of the audience, I also want to thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thanks so much, everyone.